There is a particular kind of silence that fills an apartment when someone has been stood up, and it is nothing like ordinary quiet. It has weight. It presses against the walls. And on the night that changed everything between Daniel and me, that silence arrived exactly 40 minutes after the candles were lit. Sitting there flickering over a table set for two, while only one chair remained empty, waiting for a woman who was never going to walk through that door. I remember standing in the hallway with my hand frozen on the doorknob, keys still jingling from my walk up the stairs, watching my roommate Daniel sit at our small kitchen table in a pressed blue shirt he never wore, staring at his phone like it might suddenly ring with an explanation. The apartment smelled like garlic and rosemary, and something warm and buttery that had clearly taken hours to prepare. 2 wine glasses sat untouched. A vase with 3 white tulips, obviously purchased that same afternoon, stood at the center of the table, like a small monument to hope. And Daniel, my quiet, steady, endlessly patient roommate of 2 years, looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Folded into himself in a way that made my chest ache before I even understood what I was looking at. If you believe that kindness deserves to be seen, that second chances can change a life, and that ordinary people doing quiet, generous things are worth celebrating, I want you to like this video right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that good people still exist. And subscribe to Kindness Corner if you haven't already. Because this story is going to stay with you long after it ends. I want to back up because to understand what that night meant, you have to understand who Daniel was before it happened. And you have to understand who I was too, because neither of us were the people we pretended to be. My name is Claire, and I moved into that apartment 18 months after my engagement ended in a way I still find difficult to describe without my hands shaking slightly. Not because it ended with cruelty, but because it ended with an absence. A slow fading of someone who used to memorize my coffee order and started forgetting my name in arguments. Until one day he sat me down and told me, gently, as if gentleness could soften abandonment, that he didn't feel the same way anymore. I had already put down a deposit on a wedding venue. I had already tried on the dress twice, and when that ended, something in me closed like a door being locked from the inside, and I promised myself I would never again let anyone see the parts of me that could be hurt so easily. Daniel came into my life through a roommate listing I almost didn't answer. He was renting out the second bedroom of a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with creaky floors and a kitchen too small for 2 people to cook in at once, but with large windows that let in soft afternoon light that made even sad days feel survivable. When I first met him, he had the quiet, unassuming energy of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, someone who apologized for things that weren't his fault and thanked you for things that didn't require thanks. He worked long hours as a hospital pharmacist, the kind of job that demanded precision and care but rarely earned him recognition, and he came home most nights looking like the day had asked more of him than he had left to give. For the first several months, we were little more than polite strangers sharing a space. We left notes on the fridge about grocery items. We nodded at each other in the hallway. I learned that he liked his coffee black and strong, that he ran 3 miles most mornings before the sun fully rose, and that he had a habit of leaving books he thought I might like on the small shared bookshelf, without ever mentioning it, as if kindness embarrassed him if it was acknowledged directly. I learned that he had lost his mother 2 years before I met him, a fact I discovered accidentally when I saw a photograph on his desk and asked about it, and watched his face do that particular flinch that grief leaves behind long after people expect you to have moved on. It was Daniel who noticed, before I ever said a word, that something was wrong with me. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold hours before, staring at nothing, the way you do when your mind has wandered somewhere you can't quite return from. He didn't ask what was wrong in that clumsy, invasive way people sometimes do. He simply sat down across from me, quietly, and said that he didn't need to know what happened, but that he didn't want me to sit alone if I didn't want to. That was Daniel's particular gift, the ability to offer comfort without demanding explanation, to be present without requiring performance. That night I told him about my broken engagement, the venue deposit I never got back, the dress still hanging in the back of my closet, because I couldn't bring myself to return it, or wear it or throw it away. I told him about the loneliness that had settled into my life like fog, the way I had started avoiding friends, because their happiness felt like a mirror reflecting everything I had lost. Daniel listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow reassurances people give when they don't know what else to say. When I finished, he told me something I have never forgotten. He said that heartbreak doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means you loved something enough for its absence to hurt, and that the ache would eventually become something softer, something you could carry without it crushing you. I didn't believe him that night, not fully, but I believed that he believed it, and somehow that was enough to help me sleep for the first time in weeks. From that evening forward, something between us shifted quietly without either of us naming it. We started cooking dinner together some nights, an unspoken agreement that eating in shared silence was better than eating alone. We started watching old films on the small living room television, the kind with dialogue we could recite from memory, laughing at the same lines every single time, as if hearing them fresh. I learned about his mother, about the cancer that took her slowly over 18 months, about how he had left medical school for a year to care for her, and never quite found his way back to that original path, choosing pharmacy instead, because it let him help people without asking him to watch them fade the way he had watched her fade. I learned that he still called his father every Sunday, that he kept a small framed photo of his mother on his nightstand, and that grief, for him, had become less a wound and more a quiet companion he had learned to live alongside. I want you to notice something here, because it matters for what comes later. Daniel gave enormous amounts of himself to everyone around him. He picked up extra shifts when coworkers needed time off. He remembered birthdays of people who barely remembered his. He drove 2 hours to help an old friend move apartments. On a weekend, he had been planning to finally rest. And yet, in 18 months of living together, I never once saw Daniel go on a date. I never saw him receive a call from someone who made his face light up, the way faces light up around people we're falling for. When I asked him once, gently, why he never dated, he laughed it off in that self-deprecating way he had, and said he simply hadn't met the right person yet, that he was in no rush, that he had learned patience from watching his mother endure her illness with more grace than he thought was humanly possible. But then, 3 weeks before that night with the candles, everything changed. Daniel came home from work one evening with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, a kind of cautious brightness, like sunlight breaking through clouds that had been gathered for a long time. He told me, almost sheepishly, that he had met someone. Her name was Rachel, a nurse who worked in the same hospital, someone he had crossed paths with for months in hallways and elevators, before finally working up the courage to ask her to coffee. He told me about her laugh, about the way she talked with her hands when she was excited about something, about how she had recommended a book to him that he had already started reading twice. Over those 3 weeks, I watched Daniel transform in small, beautiful ways. He started humming while he made coffee in the mornings. He bought a new shirt, the blue one I mentioned earlier, because Rachel had once mentioned she liked that color on him. He asked me, nervously, for advice about what to cook for their third date, the one he had decided would be at our apartment, a home-cooked meal he had been planning for over a week, researching recipes late into the night, testing a garlic butter sauce twice to get it exactly right. He wanted it to be special. He wanted, I think, to show Rachel a version of himself that felt permanent, not just the careful, controlled version he presented at work, but the version of him that existed in quiet domestic moments, the version that remembered how his mother used to season roasted vegetables, the version that could create warmth out of a small kitchen and a few candles. I want to be honest with you about something. Watching Daniel fall for someone stirred something complicated in me, a feeling I didn't examine closely enough at the time. I told myself it was happiness for him, uncomplicated and simple, and mostly it was. But somewhere underneath that happiness was something else, something I wouldn't be able to name until much later, a quiet ache I mistook for nostalgia about my own broken engagement, rather than what it actually was. The night of the dinner, I had plans to stay at a friend's apartment to give Daniel and Rachel privacy, but those plans fell through around 6 inches the evening, when my friend's babysitter canceled and she had to reschedule. I texted Daniel to warn him I might be coming home earlier than expected, and he told me not to worry, that Rachel wasn't arriving until 8, and that I could slip quietly into my room without disrupting anything. When I walked through the door at 7:15, the apartment already smelled like the meal he had been planning for weeks, and Daniel was moving around the kitchen with the kind of focused, nervous energy of someone trying to make everything perfect for a person whose opinion had come to matter enormously to him. I stayed in my room, giving him space, listening through the thin walls as he set the table, as he lit 2 candles, as he adjusted the lighting 3 separate times until it felt right. I heard him practicing what he might say when she arrived quietly, under his breath, the way people rehearse important moments alone in empty rooms. At 8 o'clock exactly, I heard him check his phone. At 8:15, I heard him check it again. By 8:30, the apartment had gone quiet in that particular way I described earlier, the silence of unmet expectations settling over everything like dust. I emerged from my room around 8:40, unable to stay hidden any longer, worried about him in a way that overrode my instinct to give him privacy. That's when I found him sitting at the table exactly as I described, phone in hand, candles burning down slowly, wine untouched. The meal he had spent hours preparing growing cold in the oven, where he had kept it warm. Waiting. He told me, in a voice carefully stripped of emotion, that Rachel had texted 20 minutes earlier. She had decided, she said, that she wasn't ready for something serious, that she had been reflecting on things over the past few days and felt it was better to be honest, now rather than let something develop further. She apologized for the timing, she wished him well, and that was it. An entire evening of hope and preparation dissolved into a handful of typed sentences on a screen. I sat down across from him, unsure of what to say, aware that any words I offered might feel hollow against the specific shape of his disappointment. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The candles flickered between us, illuminating a face that was trying very hard to hold itself together, the way people do when they've had practice swallowing pain quietly, rather than letting anyone see it spill over. Then, Daniel did something I did not expect. He looked up at me, and there was a fragile kind of smile forming at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that exists specifically to hold back tears. He said that the food was going to go to waste otherwise, and that it seemed foolish to let hours of cooking go uneaten simply because the evening hadn't gone as planned. He stood, walked to the oven, and brought out the meal he had prepared for Rachel. And then, carefully, deliberately, he moved his own plate down one seat, positioning it directly across from mine, and set the second plate, the one meant for her, in front of me instead. He didn't make it dramatic. He didn't turn it into a grand gesture demanding acknowledgement. He simply said that he would rather share this meal with someone who mattered to him than eat alone with a stranger's absence, sitting in the empty chair, and that if I hadn't come home early, he might have eaten it alone anyway. But he was glad in this particular moment that he didn't have to. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I think about it often even now. A man whose evening had just been quietly shattered, choosing, in the immediate aftermath of that disappointment, to offer warmth rather than withdraw into self-pity. Choosing generosity over bitterness. Choosing to see the good fortune still available to him, even in a moment that could have easily curdled into resentment. We ate together that night in a strange, tender kind of silence, the candles still burning, the tulips still standing between us like an accidental symbol of hope that refused to wilt just because circumstances had shifted. Daniel didn't talk much about Rachel that evening. He didn't need to. His disappointment was visible in the careful way he held himself, in the extra second it took him to respond to things, in the way his laugh, when it came, arrived a half-beat slower than usual. But underneath that disappointment was something else, a resilience I recognized because I had spent the past 18 months trying to build the same thing inside myself. At some point during that dinner, I told him something I had never said out loud before. I told him that watching him fall for Rachel over those 3 weeks had stirred something in me. I didn't fully understand until that exact moment, sitting across from him with candlelight flickering against his tired, hopeful face. I told him that somewhere in the last year and a half, without either of us intending it, he had become the person I looked forward to seeing at the end of long days, the person whose opinion mattered more to me than almost anyone else's, the person who had somehow, patiently and without demanding anything in return, helped me rebuild the parts of myself that heartbreak had hollowed out. He didn't respond right away. He simply looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that seems to be recalibrating everything. It's seeing, searching a familiar face for a truth that had apparently been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Then he asked, quietly, almost afraid of the answer, whether I was saying this because I felt sorry for him, because I didn't want him to feel embarrassed about being stood up. And I told him no, that I had been sitting with this feeling for months, that I had simply been too frightened of ruining what we had built to ever say it out loud, that watching him prepare for a date with someone else had forced me to finally admit to myself what I had been avoiding. There is a particular vulnerability in admitting feelings to someone on the same night they've been rejected by someone else, a fear that your honesty might feel like consolation rather than truth, that they might doubt whether you mean it or whether you're simply filling a void left by someone else's absence. Daniel voiced exactly this fear, and I understood it completely, because I would have felt the same uncertainty in his position. So instead of trying to convince him with words, I simply reached across the table and took his hand, the way you might reach for something you've wanted to hold for a long time, but were too afraid to claim. If this story is touching your heart right now, if you believe that sometimes the people who deserve love most are the ones who spend their lives quietly giving it to everyone else, I want you to take a moment and comment below. Share this story with someone you care about, and let this video reach more people who need this reminder tonight. Because what happened next is the part of this story I think about most. We didn't rush into anything that night. Daniel was careful, almost protective of what was fragile and new between us, insisting that we take time to be certain, that we not let the emotional intensity of that particular evening cloud either of our judgment. He didn't want me to mistake compassion for love, and he didn't want to mistake loneliness for connection. So, over the following weeks, we continued living as roommates, but something had shifted permanently in the space between us. We started noticing each other in new ways. The casual touches that had always existed between close friends began carrying new weight. The conversations that used to end at midnight started stretching until 2 inches the morning, neither of us willing to be the one who said good night first. I watched Daniel slowly emerge from the disappointment of that failed relationship with Rachel, not through avoidance or distraction, but through the same patient resilience he had shown his entire life. He told me once, during one of those late-night conversations, that his mother used to say that heartbreak was proof you were still capable of hoping, and that the day you stopped feeling disappointment was the day you had truly given up on connection altogether. He said that being stood up that night had hurt, genuinely and deeply, but that within that hurt had been an unexpected gift, because it had created the exact circumstances that finally allowed him to see what had been sitting quietly beside him for over a year. 3 weeks after that dinner, on a Sunday afternoon while we were cooking together in our small kitchen, working around each other in the easy choreography we had developed over 18 months of shared meals, Daniel turned to me and asked, with a kind of vulnerable directness I had rarely seen from him, whether I would consider this, whatever this was between us, an actual relationship, something we named and claimed, rather than something we simply allowed to exist in undefined, comfortable ambiguity. I remember exactly where I was standing, chopping vegetables at the counter, my hands stilling as I turned to look at him. And I remember saying yes before I had even fully processed the question, because some decisions announce themselves before your conscious mind catches up to them. What followed was not a fairy tale in the way movies often portray romance, sweeping and dramatic and immediate. It was something quieter, and I think more durable than that. We learned each other slowly, the way you learn a language you intend to speak for the rest of your life, rather than one you're cramming for a single conversation. I learned that Daniel needed quiet mornings before he could handle conversation, that he processed stress by cleaning obsessively, that he still, occasionally, dreamed about his mother and woke up disoriented by grief that resurfaced without warning. He learned that I needed reassurance after disagreements, a holdover from an engagement that had taught me that silence could be a precursor to abandonment, and he learned to offer that reassurance not because I demanded it, but because he understood where the fear came from. There were difficult moments, because every real relationship contains them. There was a stretch, about 4 months into dating, when Daniel took on additional shifts at the hospital to help cover a colleague's medical leave, and the exhaustion made him withdrawn in ways that triggered my old fears of being left behind. We had our first real argument during that period, both of us saying things shaped more by our individual wounds than by the actual situation between us. But what made that argument different from every difficult conversation in my previous engagement was that Daniel didn't disappear afterward. He didn't create distance as punishment. Instead, he sat with me the following evening and told me that he understood why exhaustion and silence might feel frightening to me, given what I had survived before, and that he was willing to communicate more clearly during stressful periods, rather than assuming I would simply understand his need for quiet. That single conversation taught me more about healthy love than years of my previous relationship ever had. It taught me that love isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of repair, the willingness of two people to return to each other after friction, rather than retreating into wounded silence. It taught me that the right partner doesn't simply avoid causing you pain, but actively works to understand the specific shape of your fears and adjusts their behavior with intention and care. Around the 8-month mark of our relationship, Daniel's father came to visit for a weekend, a quiet, thoughtful man whose resemblance to Daniel, in mannerisms more than appearance, was striking to witness. Over dinner one evening, his father told me a story about Daniel I had never heard before, about how, during his mother's illness, Daniel used to come home from hospital visits and cook elaborate meals for the family despite being utterly exhausted, because he said that filling the house with the smell of good food made it feel less like they were simply waiting for something terrible to happen. His father told me that cooking had always been Daniel's particular way of expressing love when words felt insufficient, that the meal he had prepared for Rachel that night had never really been about impressing her specifically, but about offering the deepest form of care he knew how to give. Hearing that context reshaped how I understood that entire evening. Daniel hadn't simply been performing a romantic gesture for a woman he barely knew. He had been offering, in the only language that felt natural to him, the same love he had once poured into caring for his dying mother, the same love his own father recognized in him instantly. And when that gesture was rejected, when the person meant to receive it decided she wasn't ready, Daniel's instinct wasn't to abandon that love, wasn't to let it go to waste alongside the food cooling in the oven, but to redirect it towards someone who was actually present and willing to receive it. That instinct, more than any single word spoken that night, revealed exactly who Daniel was at his core, someone whose capacity for love didn't diminish in the face of rejection, but simply sought a worthier place to land. We eventually told our close friends and family about our relationship, most of whom responded with the particular unsurprised delight of people who had apparently seen this coming long before we did ourselves. My sister told me she had suspected something between Daniel and me for months, based simply on the way I talked about him during phone calls. The small, unconscious warmth that crept into my voice whenever his name came up. Daniel's father told him, during a private conversation Daniel later shared with me, that he had never seen his son look as at peace as he did in the month since we had gotten together, that grief and loneliness had etched a kind of guardedness into Daniel after his mother's death that he hadn't fully released until now. There is something I think about often regarding that night with the candles, something beyond the romance that eventually blossomed from it. I think about how easily that evening could have gone differently, how Daniel could have retreated into bitterness or self-pity, how he could have let that rejection close him off from vulnerability, the way my broken engagement had once closed me off. Instead, in the immediate aftermath of disappointment, he chose an act of quiet generosity, moving his plate to sit across from me rather than eating alone, choosing connection over isolation, even when connection wasn't guaranteed to be reciprocated. That choice, made in a moment of genuine pain, rather than performative kindness, revealed more about Daniel's character than any grand romantic gesture ever could have. I think, too, about what it means that the version of Daniel who showed up for me that night wasn't a polished, confident man presenting his best self, but a disappointed, slightly embarrassed person choosing vulnerability anyway. He didn't try to hide his hurt from me or pretend the rejection hadn't affected him. He simply let me witness his disappointment honestly, and in doing so, created the exact conditions of trust that allowed something real to grow between us. I have come to believe that the truest connections often begin not in moments of impressive strength, but in moments of honest vulnerability, when someone allows themselves to be seen exactly as they are, disappointment and all, rather than performing a version of themselves they think you want to see. Nearly 2 years have passed since that evening, and Daniel and I now live in a slightly larger apartment, one we chose together, rather than one either of us happened to find first. We still cook dinner together most nights, though we've long since stopped keeping track of whose turn it is to choose the recipe. We still light candles sometimes, not for special occasions specifically, but simply because Daniel says that small, ordinary evenings deserve some ceremony too. That you shouldn't reserve beauty only for occasions you deem significant enough to warrant it. Every so often, usually on quiet Sunday afternoons, I catch him looking at me across our kitchen table with an expression I've come to recognize instantly. A mixture of gratitude and quiet disbelief, as if he still can't quite believe that the evening he expected to be one of the loneliest of his life turned out, instead, to be the beginning of everything that came after. Last month, Daniel proposed to me, not with an elaborate public gesture, but in our own kitchen, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while we were cooking dinner together, exactly the way we had 1,000 times before. He told me, kneeling on our kitchen floor with the pasta water boiling forgotten behind him, that he had spent years believing love required grand gestures and perfect timing, and that it had taken a canceled date and a moved dinner plate to teach him that love actually lives in the quiet, ordinary choice to keep showing up for someone. Meal after meal, evening after evening, disappointment after disappointment for the rest of your life. I said yes before he had even finished the sentence, the same way I had said yes to naming our relationship years before, because some truths simply don't require deliberation once you finally recognize them clearly. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it reminded you that heartbreak doesn't have to be the end of your capacity for love, that the right person often reveals themselves not through perfect romantic gestures, but through quiet acts of generosity in their most disappointing moments. I want you to take just a few seconds right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs this story today. Let this be a reminder to them, and to yourself, that kindness always finds its way back to the people who keep offering it, even when it feels like the world just handed it back unopened. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely love to hear your honest answer in the comments below. If you were Daniel, sitting alone at that table with the candles burning down and the food growing cold, do you think you would have had the strength to turn disappointment into an offering rather than letting it curdle into bitterness? Comment the word candlelight below if this story reminded you that second chances often arrive disguised as disappointments, and tell me about a moment in your own life when someone's quiet kindness changed everything for you. Daniel and I still eat dinner across from each other most nights, and every so often without any particular occasion demanding it, he lights 2 candles anyway, just because he says some things are worth celebrating simply for existing. And every time that soft light flickers across our small kitchen table, I remember exactly how it began, not with grand romance, but with an empty chair, a moved plate, and a man who chose generosity even in the wreckage of his own disappointment. That, I've come to believe, is what real love actually looks like, not the absence of heartbreak, but what someone chooses to do with the meal they've already prepared, once heartbreak has taken its seat at the table and left again. YouTube video description: he cooked a beautiful dinner for the woman he hoped would change his life. But she never showed up. What he did next changed everything instead. Daniel spent weeks planning the perfect evening for his date: candles, wine, a home-cooked meal made with love. But when she canceled at the last moment, instead of eating alone in silence, he made a choice that would rewrite his entire future, and it happened to be sitting quietly in the next room the whole time. This is a story about heartbreak, quiet kindness, and the second chances that often arrive disguised as disappointment. If you believe love shows up in the smallest, most unexpected moments, this one is for you. Comment candlelight if this story touched your heart, and tell us about a moment when someone's quiet kindness changed your life. Pinned comment. Sometimes the love we're looking for isn't missing. It's just been sitting quietly beside us all along. Sabenhaufen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner for more heartfelt stories about second chances, quiet kindness, and the people who change our lives when we least expect it. 118I. Kindness Corner, second chances, heartfelt story, emotional story, true love, quiet kindness, romance story, healing heart love story. Story time.